Hi, this is Dr. Devon Almond, author of The Nick of Life. Let's begin. Let the beauty we love be what we do. These opening words derive from Lebanese poet Rumi. Within these 9 words rest a profound wisdom. Not to be confused with knowledge and information, wisdom is in a world of its own. American poet T.S. Eliot inquired, "Where is the wisdom we have lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge we have lost in information?" Eliot, who received the American Medal of Freedom in 1965, recognized 3 ways of knowing inherent in our cultural evolution: the way of information, the way of knowledge, and the way of wisdom. In short, our 20th century societies and cultures were built on the ways of information and knowledge. The perennial nature of the way of wisdom was lost in the forest and cast astray in the nick of life. The nick of life dwells in time. The phrase "in the nick of time" describes a situation where guidance shows up in the most vital moment, often in the dying seconds. The nick of life refers to the timeless qualities that are essential for life. Wisdom scholar Roger Walsh explains, "For like the sorcerer's apprentice, humankind now possesses enormous knowledge, awesome power, and little wisdom. And that imbalance is a recipe for disaster." As Robert Sternberg, former president of the American Psychological Association, lamented, "If there's anything the world needs, it is wisdom. Without it, I exaggerate not at all in saying that very soon there may be no world. Humankind is now in a race between sagacity and catastrophe." The race between flourishing and death happens in the nick of life. For centuries we've been trying to make sense of the world itself and our place in the world. Yet in this perennial quest for understanding, we are continuously trying to answer the unanswerable. Clearly, guidance isn't found in the ways of information and knowledge. The ways of information and knowledge have served us well, but these ways are past their best before date. A hallmark of the now antiquated information age is overcommunication. One prevalent hallmark of overcommunication is overchoice. The multitude of communications in 21st century societies and cultures mean that we can easily get lost in the forest of noise and cast far away from the nick of life. Overcommunication means that we are inundated with information and knowledge. The way of knowledge was amplified in the 1980s when American futurist Buckminster Fuller developed the knowledge doubling curve. Its projected impact is long-lasting. By the end of World War II, knowledge was doubling every 25 years. Economies were anchored by knowledge workers whose place in the world relied on information and knowledge, more so than the physical labor that was the hallmark of the industrial age. Now, knowledge doubles every year. Soon this pattern will intensify to double every day. Yes, daily. Knowledge is no longer scarce. Neither is knowledge powerful. What is scarce and powerful is wisdom. But what exactly is wisdom? Mystical translator Jörg Fernstein clarifies, "Whatever wisdom is, it is not a matter of abstract intellectual ideas. The difference is that wisdom has a living quality. Intellectual ideas do not. Wisdom grows, transforms, and deepens a person. Intellectual ideas, at best, broaden his or her intellectual horizon." The timeless living quality in the way of wisdom is rooted in wonder and awe. Just as Greek philosopher Socrates stated that wisdom begins with wonder, the biblical reference Proverbs stated that wisdom begins with awe, a reverent, generative, living quality. This reverent, generative, living quality is reflected in the Hebrew word yirat, which means awe. But interestingly, this word also means fear. Yes, both awe and fear. This twofold meaning, which reflects what German philosopher Immanuel Kant called the sublime, implies that the living quality of awe also contains the dying quality of fear. Awe is inherent within fear, just as fear is inherent within awe. Awe reveals a deeper and higher layer than fear, as well as a grander wholeness compared to fear. Awe is the timeless interiorization of fear. Likewise, passions are born from suffering. The original essence of the word passions refers to enduring suffering. The The patience to endure suffering is illuminated by the overlapping meaning of the Hebrew words for enduring, suffering, and patience. The resiliency for enduring suffering can, but doesn't necessarily produce the living quality of growth, depth, and transformation inherent within the way of wisdom. Vertical and horizontal learning. Learning happens in both vertical and horizontal ways. The living quality that grows, transforms, and deepens a person in the way of wisdom speaks to vertical learning. With vertical learning, our worldviews, ways of making meaning, and capacities for taking perspectives fundamentally change. That is, grow, transform, and deepen. On the other hand, horizontal learning involves accumulating information and acquiring knowledge that broadens and improves oneself without impacting the living quality of our worldviews, ways of making meaning, and capacities for taking perspective. Feuerstein continues, intellectual ideas are tied into other intellectual ideas to make a web of models or systems. Wisdom organically relates to other living values which uplift and make whole. Intellectual ideas increase information and knowledge. Wisdom enhances the quality of life and is healing. The way of information and the way of knowledge represents a dying quality, whereas the way of wisdom represents a living quality. The direction is different. The former ways facilitate the efficiency of improvement. The latter way enlivens life so that we become more and more of who we already are. The horizontal learning that marks the ways of information and knowledge can be paralleled to a railroad track. On the railroad track of life, we look to the past to project forward into the future. What happened yesterday is perceived to happen tomorrow. We can predict where we are going based on where we are and where we have been. The patterns of life are predictable. On the railroad track of life, we keep moving along in an established direction until the train of ourselves hits a brick wall. Unless and until we experience these disorienting life dilemmas, life on the horizontal railroad track has a sort of flat landing effect. On the flatlands, the geography of our inner lives remains pretty much the same. We're not really stirred until life is disoriented, through, for example, the diagnosis of disease, a disastrous divorce, or being laid off from the most meaningful work. How we unconsciously react or consciously respond to these disorienting life dilemmas influences whether we step back onto the horizontal railroad track of life or vertically mature in a more generative living quality. Existential analyst Viktor Frankl describes this phenomenon in his classic book, Man's Search for Meaning. Between stimulus and response, there is a sacred space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl, a Nazi concentration camp survivor, suggests that in every moment, this sacred space allows us to relate to a situation in an either-or way, either toward the living quality of growth, depth, and transformation, or toward the dying quality that aims to efficiently get us back on track. The attention that shapes these choices are held within ourselves and happen in the nick of life. The happiness inherent in flourishing happens in the nick of life, moment after accumulated moment. This reality is reflected in the original essence of the word happiness, which refers to happen chance. The compounding effect of happen chance implies that our moment-to-moment choices shape what we perceive as life possibilities. When we touch into the sacred space between what happens to us and how we relate to this happening, we open into shaping our life possibilities. The stimulus of what happens to us and how we relate to these happenings represent two polarities. Between all polarities rests a sacred space where both polarities are alive. Consider the in-breath and the out-breath. Both the inward stroke and outward stroke of breath, that is life, are necessary for a living quality. If I were to cling to either the in-breath or the out-breath, I would certainly die. Similarly, when we cling to either what happens to us or how we relate to this happening, we tend to unconsciously react. Ways of knowing that hold both and life possibilities are very different than ways of knowing that hold either or possibilities. An example is the learning process of healing. The horizontal track of healing aims to efficiently get us back on track to where we were before the fracture. With vertical healing, healing holds a living quality that transforms fractures into functionalities and life possibilities into lived actualities. On the railroad track of life, we often hold fixed mindsets of life possibilities. Whereas horizontal learning is akin to a train moving along a fixed track, vertical learning reflects the travel patterns of ships and planes. Nearly always off course, yet held in highly fluid environments, ships and planes continuously adjust in the nick of life. The travel patterns of ships and planes reflect what motivational psychologist Carol Dweck calls growth mindsets. These mindsets necessitate the resiliency shaped by endurance, suffering, and patience to grow beyond our innate talents. The growth mindsets of ships and planes allow us to be both anchored in who we are and flexible, malleable, and fluid. This twofold way deepens and heightens our ways of knowing. 3 ways of knowing. The way of wisdom represents both the perennial origins and leading edge of our societies and cultures. Wisdom is the essence of who we really are. It exists in a different forest than the ways of information and knowledge. Let's briefly explore these 3 very different ways of knowing. Way of information. Information is when data, that is, facts and figures, are organized. Differentiating through physical discrimination, information provides good reference points. Information is the epitome of pre-conventional worldviews. The original essence of the word information refers to instruction or training. With this way of knowing, the way is already known. We as students just have to find it somewhere out there. We are dependent on the outside to find our way. Way of knowledge. When information is organized into patterns, we create knowledge. Understanding is a gift that comes from knowledge. Differentiating through mental distinction, knowledge is the epitome of conventional worldviews. The same exterior orientation applies to the way of knowledge, though an interior awareness is also arising. With this way of knowing, we are no longer dependent to find the way. Rather, we are independent and forge ahead in this scientific quest for knowledge. Not surprisingly, the original essence of the word knowledge refers to science, the hallmark of objectivity. Way of wisdom. Wisdom is the rightful application of this understanding to real-life situations based on universal values. Wisdom is the capacity to look, listen, and be present in evolutionary, beneficial, and benevolent ways. Differentiating through spiritual discernment, wisdom transcends and includes post-conventional worldviews. The way of wisdom holds a grander robustness than earlier ways of knowing in that this way also includes the unexplored interiorities of earlier ways of knowing. Grounded in generative love, wisdom is an interdependent integration, expansion, and refinement of a prevailing unity. We develop these ways of knowing in a sequential manner. Just as information relies on data and knowledge relies on information, wisdom relies on knowledge. This sequence means that each later way of knowing is cultivated in a way that transcends and includes earlier ways of knowing. Each later way of knowing reveals a fuller wholeness. You can think of knowledge as a container or context that holds information, in the same way that information is a container that holds data. The wholeness of wisdom holds a grander robustness than information and knowledge. Put in another context, you can consider a sentence as a container that holds words, and words as a container that holds letters. In this analogy, information is a letter, knowledge is a word, and wisdom is the sentence. Each part is a whole in itself, but only a part of a grander wholeness. Generally speaking, the ways of information and knowledge are held in degenerative containers. In these containers, experiencing often happens as teachers and students follow a fixed track. In these containers, the power structures between teachers and students frequently parallel the doctor and patient relationship. Consider that the original essence of the word doctor means to teach. while the original essence of the word patient refers to struggle and submit. Generative containers support facilitators to draw out life possibilities into lived actualities. To be clear, the ways of information, knowledge, and wisdom exist on a spectrum that runs from the exterior to the depths and heights of the interior, or from the objective to the subjective. This is not to conflate wisdom with personal opinion or subjective knowing. Wisdom is qualitatively different than mere subjective ways of knowing. Rather, the reverent, generative living quality of the way of wisdom weaves together both the inner and outer and the individual and collective. These qualities are drawn out in world wisdom traditions. For example, Jewish wisdom literature describes both wisdom and God using identical, timeless qualities: holy, unique, manifold, incisive, pure, lucid, invulnerable, keen, gracious, irresistible, loyal, trustworthy, all-powerful, all-pervading, and all-penetrating. The way of wisdom is both unique and connective. In contrast, the ways of information and knowledge are either unique, or individual, or collective. The way of information is narrow. The way of knowledge is broad. The way of wisdom is refined and based on an understanding that reflects a robust depth and height, which is then refined. While both the ways of information and knowledge involve accumulation, the way of wisdom is about refinement. This refinement happening in the nick of life means lessening into who we really are as we paradoxically become more and more of who we really are. American poet David Wagoner beautifully demonstrates this directionality in his poem, Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here, and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. You must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you. This poem, like the very nature of art, beauty, and aesthetic appreciation, is distinct from the ways of information and knowledge. Appreciation which recognizes one's present value and the maturing nature of this value reflects the way of wisdom. Wisdom lets the beauty we love be what we do. The forest of wisdom breathes wherever we are. We open into the way of wisdom when we open ourselves to look, listen, and be present in evolutionary, beneficial, and benevolent ways based on the universal values of nature. The way of wisdom means letting the stranger find us in a reverent manner. Looking and listening. The ways of information, knowledge, and wisdom mirror how we look and listen in the world. As we evolve to deeper and higher ways of looking and listening, we transcend the details and include the essence into grander, more robust ways of knowing. We dwell in the nick of life. Christian contemplative St. Bonaventure identified 3 distinct eyes through which we see the world. 1, an eye of flesh. 2, an eye of mind. And 3, an eye of spirit. Since both our eyes and ears reflect our dominant exterior senses, let's extend these 3 eyes to also include our ears. This expansion creates 3 eyes and ears to look and listen in the world. Eyes and ears of flesh. In Hindu and Buddhist terms, these eyes and ears reflect a gross way of knowing. We go outward to look and listen at what is in the immediate environment and sense through the eyes and ears. Because we are taking in what is physically around us in the exterior, there's a clear intake orientation. This is the way of information. Eyes and ears of mind. In Hindu and Buddhist terms, these eyes and ears reflect a subtle way of knowing. In addition to going outward to look and listen at what is in the world and in the immediate environment, as sensed through these eyes and ears, we subtly go inward to look and listen at how. The content of what is physically sensed is related. Context becomes a consideration as we recognize patterns and relationships between the invisible, interior elements with exteriorities. This is the way of knowledge. Eyes and ears of spirit. In Hindu and Buddhist terms, these eyes and ears reflect a causal way of knowing, whereas the earlier ways of knowing involve firstly consuming what is in the exterior and then relating how this pertains to the interior. This way of knowing involves integrating the essence of all that is, was, and ever will be. Through these eyes and ears, we look and listen to the deeper and higher, more robust why and who of life. This is the way of wisdom. Let's demonstrate the three eyes and ears through an example. Reflect on the lost poem and imagine you're in a beautiful forested environment. Way of information. Through the way of information, in which you're informed by the eyes and ears of flesh, you'll see and hear what is on the surface. When asked to describe the environment, you'll likely mention the trees ahead and bushes beside you, along with the sounds of raven and wren and so on. Although you may offer some objective discrimination, the forest is likely to be confused with the trees. You'll likely also recognize the extrinsic value of what you're seeing and hearing. For example, you may see the utility of the trees as lumber, the value of the land, and so on. You may point out that the location would be a pretty spot to build a house. Nature is out there and separate to you. It is objective. Way of knowledge. Through the way of knowledge, in which your knowing derives from the eyes and ears of both flesh and mind, you'll see and hear what is on the surface. In addition, the exterior nature of your seeing and hearing will adopt the interior qualities of looking and listening. You'll begin to also make subjective distinctions between the plurality of the forest and the singularity of the trees. As you look and listen into interiorities, you're likely to notice how the forest breathes. You'll naturally look and listen into both the visible and exterior and invisible interior relationships within the ecosystem that also includes you. You're entering into subjective relationship with nature. Way of wisdom. Through the way of wisdom, you're guided by the eyes and ears of flesh, mind, and contemplation. You'll not only see and hear what is on the surface, and look and listen into how interior and exterior elements are related, but you'll also integrate the essence of all that is, was, and ever will be into the why and who of life. Guided by contemplation and discernment, the essence, appreciation, and beauty of the whole scene comes to the forefront as you integrate with the natural environment. As the forest breathes, so do you. Standing still, you notice that no two trees are the same to raven or wren. Recognizing that the forest knows where you are, you recognize the living quality of nature as yourself. Anchors of the three ways. These three eyes and ears anchor three ways of knowing. We can also draw on other perennial philosophies to further refine these three ways of knowing. For instance, Hindu philosophy defines three qualities of nature. According to this philosophy, these qualities are present in all of us and everything to different extents. We do not exist entirely in either of the three qualities. Rather, through our presence, we hold the potentialities to access each quality. 1. A tamasic quality of nature refers to the doubts of darkness, disorder, and destruction. Anchoring the eyes and ears of flesh, this quality reflects the narrow discrimination inherent with the way of information. 2. A rajasic quality of nature refers to the energies of passion, activity, and confusion. Anchoring the eyes and ears of mind, this quality mirrors the broad distinctions inherent within the way of knowledge. 3. A sattvic quality of nature refers to the essence of goodness, harmony, and construction. Anchoring the eyes and ears of spirit, this quality is the refined discernment inherent within the way of wisdom. Recall that discrimination, distinction, and discernment represent the three ways of differentiation in the three ways of knowing. This differentiation shows up in wisdom traditions across the world. For example, the Islamic wisdom literature defines three ways of prayer. 1. The way of prayer that is anchored in fear is the way of the slave. 2. The way of prayer that is anchored in desire is the way of the traitor. 3, the way of prayer that is anchored in gratitude is the way of liberation. These ways of prayer reflect a spectrum that spans from limitation to liberation. The way of the slave is the way of information. Differentiating through discrimination, we consume information and are fearfully held hostage by its influence. The way of the traitor is the way of knowledge. Differentiating through distinction, we recognize the relationships between disparate elements and desire to exchange worse for better. The way of liberation is the way of wisdom. Differentiating through discernment, gratitude is inherent in freeing ourselves from earlier ways of knowing. Interestingly, the original essence of the word liberation refers to freeing people. This freeing is anchored in gratitude. Gratitude becomes increasingly alive as our ways of knowing evolve. Gratitude is first considered in the way of information. Gratitude is then controlled in the way of knowledge. Alas, gratitude is core to the way of wisdom. This evolutionary trajectory from outer consideration through controlling the outside influence on the inside into wholly integrating this into our integrative core is reflected in Chinese philosopher Confucius' 3-track to wisdom. 1. The bitter track to wisdom is the way of experience. 2. The easy track to wisdom is the way of imitation. 3. The noble track to wisdom is the way of reflection. The bitter track by itself doesn't really develop into wisdom. This is the way of information. Neither does the easy track by itself really develop into wisdom. This is the way of knowledge. Both of these tracks, while necessary ingredients for wisdom, also require a third, transcendent ingredient: reflection. Only the noble track holds the necessary ingredients for wisdom. On one hand, all of life is experience, which can be both limiting and liberating. Recognizing the developmental importance of the ingredients proposed by Confucius, American educational philosopher John Dewey points out that people do not learn from experience. Rather, learning happens through reflecting on experience. Experience necessitates a metacognitive container that reflectively grows from the limitation of imitation into the deliberation of liberation. This deliberate, transcendent track is worth following. Interestingly, the original essence of the word learning refers to following a track. The educational concept praxis tells us that learning includes 3 ingredients. 1. The physical experience through the way of information. 2. The mental theory through the way of knowledge. And 3. The spiritual reflection through the way of wisdom. Whatever we call these 3 ingredients, these qualities encompass 3 ways of knowing, or 3 motivational stages, to use the language of American business writer Daniel Pink. The way of information, reflective in what Pink calls motivation 1.0, is anchored by deficiency-based physical needs. These needs reflect an emptiness that once filled through satisfaction simply return to their original form of emptiness. Of course, the dying quality inherent within the flat-landing nature of needs is completely unsustainable. The way of knowledge, reflective in Motivation 2.0, taps into the realm of the mind. The satisfaction of earlier physical drives and the cultivation of mental interest transitions into more sufficiency-based values. We start to cognize and recognize questions like, what can I uniquely contribute? What is my niche? And how can I serve? The way of wisdom, reflective in what Pink calls Motivation 3.0, involves learning, caring, and creatively to generatively serve all, including ourselves. The sufficiency-based starting point happens in the nick of life. In this way, we spontaneously know what to do as we outgrow cultural conditioning. In the ways of information and knowledge, we grow into the containers of our cultural surroundings. Yet these containers are often degenerative. To demonstrate, imagine a container that includes the seedling of a plant with all of the ingredients necessary for its growth. Now imagine the container has a lid on it. Our antiquated social and cultural ways of knowing create a lid of limitation. In this example, the plant is ourselves. When the container for growth, deepening, and transformation prematurely limits us, our minds look outside for direction. When the ingredients in our container are insufficient for the living quality, we imitate. A premature lid of limitation creates a lid of imitation. The intellect is vagabond, and our system of education fosters restlessness. Our minds travel when our bodies are forced to stay at home. We imitate. And what is imitation but the traveling of the mind? These words, etched by American transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson in the 1800s, remind us that the living quality in the way of wisdom happens in the nick of life. Or as American author Malcolm Gladwell communicated in his book by the same name, in a blink. Emerson's protege, Henry David Thoreau, who articulates trust, simplicity, and magnanimity as the timeless qualities that are essential for life in the way of wisdom, elaborates. In any weather, at any hour of the day or night, I have been anxious to improve the nick of time and notch it on my stick, to stand on the meeting of two eternities, the past and the future, which is precisely the present moment. This presence, along with the potentiality that comes from the living quality of presence, is both now here and nowhere. This happens in the nick of life, present between flourishing and death. Knowing that wise change first necessitates death, let the beauty we love be what we do. Thanks for listening.